What would you do if the biggest mistake of your life turned out to be the most important thing you ever did? Hold that question, because that is exactly what happened to Richard Carter. On a cold December night in Boston, when he walked through the wrong hospital door, he was already singing before he realized she wasn't his grandmother. That's the part that still gets me. Not the wrong room, not the grocery store daisies wilting in his fist. The fact that when he finally understood what he'd stumbled into, when he saw the tubes, the wires, the ventilator keeping steady time like a clock in an empty house, he didn't leave. He sat down, and he kept singing. December 14th, 2024, Massachusetts General Hospital, Boston. The fluorescent lights in the ICU corridor hummed like a jar of hornets somebody forgot to put back on the shelf. Richard Carter, 36 years old, janitor, single father. He stood in the hallway clutching a small bunch of grocery store daisies. He had promised his kids he'd visit their great-grandmother every night after his shift. He was a man who kept his promises, even the small ones, especially the small ones. Because in the 3 years since the divorce, the small promises were the scaffolding that held everything upright. He pushed open the door to what he believed was room 412. He froze. It was room 410. The woman in the bed was not his 78-year-old grandmother. This woman was young, 35 maybe. Blonde hair spread across the pillow like it had stopped fighting. Skin pale as the good china only brought out at Thanksgiving. Tubes. Wires. A ventilator breathing for her. Hiss. Click. Hiss. Click. Steady and indifferent as a metronome. No flowers on the nightstand, no get well cards, no family photos. Nothing. Just white walls, white sheets, and a machine doing the living. Richard stood there, daisies in hand, coat still damp from the parking lot. He should have backed out quietly. He almost did, but then he looked at her hand, resting on top of the white sheet, still, alone. The way a hand looks when it has been waiting a long time for something to hold, and has quietly given up expecting it. Richard knew that kind of alone. The apartment so silent after the divorce, he left the Weather Channel on just to hear a human voice. Lying awake listening to his children breathe through the wall. Relieved they were there. Gutted by the quiet. He knew what it felt like to be in a room and have no one in it with you. He set the daisies on the window ledge, lowered himself into the empty chair, and in a voice that was rough and trembling and completely untrained, he began to sing. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. He didn't know her name. He didn't know she owned the building he mopped every night. He didn't know she had been lying in that room for 7 full weeks, and that not one single person had come to sit with her. She had heard everything, except a voice that was singing to her. Until now. What happened when the night nurse walked in and found him there is where this story takes its first unexpected turn. Nurse Lily had worked the ICU night shift for 6 years. She had seen a great many things walk through those doors. Hysterical families, exhausted residents, one very confused food delivery driver who had no business being on the 4th floor. She had never walked in to find a janitor singing. She stood in the doorway, clipboard pressed to her chest. For a moment she just listened. His voice was nothing remarkable, a little rough. The way a hardwood floor sounds when it needs refinishing but you love it too much to change. But there was something in it that made her stop. Something that felt less like music and more like company. She cleared her throat gently. He jolted so hard the daisies slid off the ledge. He caught them, barely. I'm sorry, he said, face coloring. Wrong room. I didn't mean to. It's all right, Lily said softly. Your grandmother is in 412, just 2 doors down. She glanced at the woman in the bed. Her voice went quieter. This is Simone Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Medical Group. She owns this hospital and 3 others across the state. Car accident, 7 weeks ago. A pause. Not one family member has come. Richard looked at the hand resting alone on the white sheet. 7 weeks, he said. Not a question, just the weight of it. He went to see his grandmother, sat with her 40 minutes, listened to her grievances about the hospital jello, then drove home through the Boston cold, where Olivia had left a permission slip on the counter weighted down by a ketchup bottle, and Oliver had fallen asleep on the couch with a blue crayon still in his fist. He tucked them both in, stood in the kitchen in the quiet, the refrigerator humming, the radiator ticking, thinking about a hand on a white sheet. 7 weeks, not one visitor. He thought about the night Olivia had a fever of 103, when he'd sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for 4 hours, just being there. She'd woken up and said, "I knew you were here, Daddy. I could feel you." The next evening, after his shift, he went back to room 410, and the evening after that, and the one after that. He started with Beatles songs, "Here Comes the Sun," then Simon and Garfunkel, then soft hymns from his mother's little Baptist church on Elm Street, where the choir was 3 women and a man named Gerald, who was mostly there for the potluck. He talked to her the way you talk when you've run out of reasons to be guarded. He told her about the divorce, about raising Olivia and Oliver on a janitor's salary, learning to braid hair from a YouTube tutorial at 11 at night, standing in the cereal aisle for 10 minutes because Oliver had strong feelings about the color of the box. He told her about the Tuesday morning he'd sat in a fogged-up truck in a hospital parking lot with nowhere to go. "That was the loneliest I've ever been," he said. "Just sitting there while the windows went white." He paused, looking at her still face. "I think you might know something about that kind of quiet," he said gently. "The kind that fills a room even when you're the most important person in it." Somewhere in the deep stillness of her coma, Simone Sinclair heard every word. She couldn't move, couldn't open her eyes, but that voice, rough, unhurried, completely unbothered by who she was or what she owned. It cut through the dark the way a porch light cuts through fog. Warm, steady, not asking anything of her. She had built the company, she had earned the place. And somewhere in 7 weeks of lying still with nothing to do but listen, she had started to understand that the cost had been higher than she had let herself count. One evening, Richard brought photographs, 2 small prints from the Walgreens photo counter. He propped them against her water pitcher. "That's Olivia, she's 8, he smiled. "And that's Oliver, he's 5. He told me, direct quote, 'Dad, kindness is the one thing nobody can ever take from you.'" A pause. He heard it from a cartoon. "I've been thinking about it all week." On Christmas night, he strung battery-powered lights along her window ledge. $4 from the bin near the register at the drugstore. Olivia had helped him pick them. Very seriously. The way 8-year-olds are serious about things that actually matter. He taped a drawing she'd made to the wall beside the monitor. A crayon picture. A tall man singing to a woman in a bed. Little stars around the window. At the bottom, in careful looping print, "For the lady who is sleeping." "You are not alone," he said quietly. "And I believe, I really do, that kindness finds its way back to us, somehow, eventually." Nurse Lily found him there at 10:30. "Her vitals improve every time you're here," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Does anyone else know I come?" "Just me," she said, "and her." But what Simone had been absorbing, every song, every story, every honest word, was about to become the thing that changed both their lives. Because on January 11th, something happened that the medical team would later struggle to fully explain. Her finger moved. January 11th, 2025. 28 days after Richard Carter first walked into the wrong room. He was reading aloud from a slim poetry paperback he'd found in the hospital's donation library. The spine cracked from years of handling. A name written inside the front cover in faded blue ink. Margaret. 1987. He read slowly. The way you read to someone when you want them to hear the meaning, not just the words. He was halfway through a Robert Frost poem when he almost missed it. A twitch. The smallest possible movement. Simone's right index finger, curling just slightly against the white sheet. Like a hand reaching for something it had forgotten it ever held. Richard stopped reading. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. Her eyelids were moving. For one long, suspended moment, he didn't breathe, didn't call out, He just sat there, poetry book open in his lap, the room holding its breath around him, watching something come back from a very long way away. Then he was on his feet and out the door, calling down the corridor at a volume that had completely abandoned any sense of indoor propriety. The doctors used the word remarkable. They used it carefully. The way doctors use words when the chart says one thing and the patient in front of them says something else entirely. Her neurological response was stronger than projected. Her cognitive function, preliminary indicators suggested, was largely intact. One attending physician, a young woman who looked like she hadn't slept since October, stood in the doorway of room 410 after the assessments and said quietly, to no one in particular, 7 weeks. She should not be this coherent. Nurse Lily, standing just behind her, said nothing, but her eyes moved, slowly, to the battery-powered lights along the window ledge and the crayon drawing taped to the wall beside the monitor. For the lady who is sleeping, she had her own theory. She kept it to herself. 2 days later, the room was quiet again. Richard had come after his shift, same as always. He sat in the chair, the one with the wobbly left leg he'd started bracing with his foot without thinking about it. The way you stop noticing the creaky step on the staircase after a while. He said hello to the room, the way he always did. And then, in a voice like gravel and rust and something slowly remembering how to work, she spoke. You kept singing. Richard went completely still. Her eyes were open, blue, sharp as a January morning, focused on him with an intensity that made him feel, briefly, like he'd wandered into a board meeting in his work uniform. Every night, she said, slower, making sure the words were real. I heard all of it. I didn't know if you could, he said carefully. I could. Silence settled, not the empty kind, the kind that has weight and warmth pressed into it. Tears moved down her face. She didn't lift her hand to stop them. She fell quietly, and she let them. And there was something in that, in the letting. That looked like a woman who had been holding herself very tightly for a very long time, and had finally, in this room, with this person, decided she didn't have to. You told me I wasn't alone, she said. You weren't, he said simply. She looked at him the way someone looks when they've had weeks of nothing to do but listen, and have become very good at it. Do you know who I am? She asked. He shook his head, honest as a handshake. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, something older. My name is Simone Sinclair, she said. I own this hospital, and 3 others. You work for me, have for 4 years apparently. Richard looked around the room, at the white walls, the monitors, the $4 lights, the drawing from a little girl who had never met her. Huh, he said. She waited. I only know you're a person who needed someone to sit with, he said finally. The rest of it isn't really my business. She cried then, the kind that has been stored behind a locked door for a very long time. Not from weakness, but from years of having had no room that was safe enough to put it. A nurse appeared in the doorway, took one look, and quietly withdrew. When Simone steadied herself, she looked at the crayon drawing on the wall. Who made that? My daughter, Olivia, 8 years old, never met you. She drew me stars. She said the lady sleeping alone deserved some. Simone was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, more careful. I had a daughter who used to draw me things, she said, when she was small, little houses, yellow suns in the top corner, always smiling. Because that's how children draw suns, the way the world is supposed to look. She stopped, looked at her hands. I used to tape them to my office window. She made them until she was about 10, and then she stopped. A long pause. I was traveling that month, a conference in Chicago. I don't remember what it was about. I remember Sophia's face when I got home, and the drawings were gone from her desk, and I didn't ask why. Richard didn't say anything. He understood the value of not filling a silence like that. I kept telling myself there would be more time, Simone said, that when the company was stable, when the next quarter was finished, when the next acquisition closed, then I would slow down, then I would be present. She exhaled slowly. There was always a next quarter. There's still time, Richard said quietly. She came when she heard you were hurt. That means she hasn't stopped. Simone looked at him. "How did you know she came?" "Because that's what kids do," he said. "No matter what, they come." He said it simply, without sentiment, as a fact. The kind of fact you learn not from reading it somewhere, but from being the parent who shows up every night, even when you're tired, even when the room is quiet and no one seems to be listening, and discovering that they always know you were there. Then, very quietly, she asked, "Your children, are they all right, with you working these hours?" Such a small question, such a human one. Richard blinked, slightly caught. "They're with my neighbor, Mrs. Patton, on late nights. She's retired, loves them like they're her own grandkids." He paused. "We're okay. We've learned to be okay. You told me about them. During—" She stopped. "I remember everything. The ketchup bottle on the permission slip, Oliver's crayon, the YouTube tutorial at 11 at night. You remember all of that." "Every word," she said. "You have no idea what it meant. To have something real to listen to, something that wasn't monitors or shift changes or silence." "I'm glad," he said, and he meant it in the simple, uncomplicated way that was characteristic of him. No performance, no angle, just glad. And neither of them knew. Sitting in that quiet room with the crayon stars on the wall and the small lights glowing along the ledge, that a storm was already in the air. It had dark eyes and a one-way ticket from New York City. It was 19 years old, and it was not going to arrive gently. A week after Simone Sinclair opened her eyes, she was sitting up in bed reading quarterly reports on a tablet propped against her water pitcher. The tubes were gone. The color had returned to her face. Her assistant, Preston, pressed shirt, laptop. The expression of a man who had been single-handedly holding a dam together for 7 weeks. He had appeared on day 3 with 17 urgent priorities. She'd sent him to the hallway after 45 minutes. He'd sat down in a plastic chair and appeared to be quietly making peace with something. She was healing fast. The medical staff said so with a careful kind of wonder, as if the numbers were telling them one story and the woman in the bed was telling them another. And they weren't entirely sure which one to believe. But every evening, when Richard arrived after his shift, the tablet went face down on the nightstand. That had become the arrangement, without discussion. He sat in the chair. She set the tablet down, simple as breathing. He had no idea what she was about to hand him, and he had absolutely no idea what it would cost. On a gray Tuesday afternoon, the kind of January day that makes Boston look like a photograph someone left in a coat pocket too long, Simone asked him to sit down with a tone that indicated she had already made a decision and was delivering it, not proposing it. She was holding a check. $500,000. Richard looked at it. Then he looked at her. "No," he said. She blinked. "Excuse me? I'm not taking it." Quiet, settled, not defiant, just honest. The way he was always honest. The way a man is honest when he has decided that honesty is the one thing worth protecting. "I didn't come back every night waiting for something. I came because I didn't want you to be alone. The same reason anyone ought to do anything for anyone. A beat. That's all it was." Simone sat with that. In 35 years, 20 of them spent in rooms where everyone wanted something from her. She had never once had someone decline her money on the grounds of simply not having wanted anything to begin with. She didn't know what to do with it, so she called Sophia. Sophia Sinclair arrived the next morning on the first flight out of New York. 19 years old, dark-eyed, sharp-jawed, carrying the particular self-sufficiency of a young woman who learned early that relying on people was a risk with an unpredictable return. She had grown up largely in the presence of housekeepers, tutors, a rotating cast of her mother's assistants who were kind but temporary, and a mother who was brilliant and driven and somewhere else. She had never blamed her mother, not exactly, but she had quietly, systematically learned to need very little from anyone. And she had learned, the way children learn the things nobody teaches them, that when strangers appeared to care about someone with money and power, it was wise to understand why before you decided to be grateful. She got the story from Preston first, the janitor, the wrong room, 28 nights of songs and stories. The check her mother had written, the man who refused it. She walked into room 410 and looked directly at Richard. "Who are you?" Cold and flat as a January sidewalk. Richard stood up from the chair. "You must be Sophia. Answer the question." "I'm Richard Carter. I'm a janitor here. I accidentally walked into your mother's room 4 weeks ago, and I didn't want her to be alone. That's the whole story." "That is not the whole story." Her voice was controlled, and underneath it, just barely, the seams were showing. "Nobody comes back every single night for a month for nothing. Nobody refuses $500,000 for nothing. So tell me, what do you actually want from her?" "Nothing," he said. "Nothing from her. Nothing from you." Her chin lifted. "I'm going to have our legal team look into your record. I'm going to have you removed from this hospital. And if I find one thing, one detail, that doesn't match what you're telling me, I'll make sure people know it." Richard's jaw tightened. His throat moved. He looked at her, not with anger, but with something sadder than anger, recognition. "I understand," he said quietly. "I understand exactly why you'd think that." He picked up his jacket, nodded once, to Simone, not to Sophia, and walked out. The door closed. Simone looked at her daughter for a long moment. "You were wrong," she said, evenly. No anger. Just the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent 7 weeks doing nothing but listening, and had become very sure of what she knew. "Mom, I heard him for 28 nights, Simone said. Every song, every story, every word he said to a woman he believed couldn't hear him. He told me about his children, his divorce, the morning he sat in a fogged-up truck with nowhere to go. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. That is not performance. That is a person. And you just treated him the way every person in my world treats someone in his position, as if he must be running an angle, because who would ever simply help someone without one? Sophia said nothing. I did the same thing, Simone said quietly, for years, to everyone. She looked at her hands, folded on the white sheet. It is a very lonely way to live, I know, because I lived it. And for 7 weeks I lay in this room and had nothing to do but understand what it had cost me. Sophia stood in the silence of that. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes moved, slowly, almost despite herself, to the crayon drawing on the wall, the tall man, the sleeping woman, the yellow stars drawn by a child who had never met her mother, a child who had drawn stars for a stranger anyway. Something behind Sophia's eyes shifted. Like a window that has been painted shut, and someone has finally pressed a hand against the glass. She didn't say anything yet, but it was the beginning of something. That night in his apartment, Richard sat on the couch with Olivia pressed to his left side and Oliver asleep against his right. A Hallmark movie played on the television. His mother had recommended it weeks ago. He'd never gotten around to it until now. He watched it without seeing it. At some point, Olivia looked up at him. "Dad, you look sad." He pulled her in closer. She smelled like shampoo and the faint ghost of crayon wax. His 2 favorite smells in the world. The smells of his actual life, the one that mattered. "I'm learning something," he said. "What?" "That doing the right thing and being understood for it don't always happen at the same time." Olivia considered this with the particular gravity of an 8-year-old who has learned that certain conversations with her father require her full attention. Oliver says, good people get misunderstood. Oliver is 5. He watches a lot of documentaries. Richard laughed, short, surprised, the kind that arrives one step ahead of tears and sometimes goes instead of them. He pressed his face into the top of her head and held on. "Yeah," he said. "Your brother's right." He sat there long after both kids were asleep, the apartment settling around him in its familiar way, the radiator ticking, the refrigerator humming, the sounds of a home that was small and imperfect and entirely his. He thought about Oliver's hand around a crayon, about Olivia taping those yellow stars to a stranger's wall, about the kind of people his children were becoming. He thought, I must be doing something right. And he thought, kindness sometimes costs you. You pay anyway, because the alternative is becoming someone your children wouldn't recognize. what he couldn't have imagined. Sitting there in that quiet, was that the answer to every cost was already building? Not in a courtroom, not in a letter, in a circuit board, in the ICU of the hospital he mopped every night. Coming in fast, arriving at 11 minutes past 11 on a February evening, and it was going to change every single thing. Mid-February 2025, Massachusetts General Hospital, 11:14 p.m. The ICU's backup ventilator system failed without an announcement. One monitor in a room most people passed without reading threw a warning. Then a second. Then a cascade. Quiet and technical and absolutely devastating. Then a sound from the backup panel like an engine that had finally, permanently decided it was done. 3 patients were on full ventilator support. Without the backup, the primary line had 40 minutes, maybe 50. The hospital's engineering team arrived in 11 minutes. 8 experienced professionals pulling up schematics, speaking in the fast, compressed language of people for whom the clock is not a figure of speech tonight. They worked for 1 hour, then 2, then 3. Nothing. The head of engineering, a man named Douglas, 22 years in the field, the kind of professional who did not use the word stumped and had never had cause to until this moment. He stood back from the panel at 1:38 a.m. and said in a voice stripped of everything except facts, "Get me the contractor on the phone, now." The contractor was 2 hours away. Simone Sinclair was standing in the corridor. She had been there for 40 minutes. She was technically still a patient. Her physician had made this point recently and with some feeling. But she was also the person whose name was on the building, and tonight that argument was winning. No one said anything to her about it. She looked at the clock on the corridor wall. She looked at the engineering team. She looked at the cluster of board members who had materialized from somewhere. The CFO, 2 directors, standing at the edge of the hallway with the collective uselessness of people who are very good at managing things that can be managed, and have come up against something that cannot. She thought about 3 patients, 3 rooms, machines doing the breathing, no one holding their hand. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised even her, about a room with white walls and no flowers, and a hand resting alone on a white sheet, about what it had taken for one person to simply decide that was not acceptable, about what that decision had meant to her. She understood something now that she had not understood before those 7 weeks. Being responsible for a building full of people did not mean managing them from a distance. It meant knowing who was in the rooms. It meant knowing who was in the hallway. She looked down the corridor, and there he was, Richard Carter, gray uniform, MGH logo on the left chest, pushing a supply cart toward the utility closet at the far end, working the overnight shift. He had come back to work, quietly, without announcement, without waiting to be thanked or vindicated, because this was his job, and this was what he did. He hadn't seen her yet. She started walking. "Richard!" He stopped, turned, took in the full scene. Simone out of her room, the engineers bent over the panel, the board members at the corridor's edge. The quality of silence that fills a hallway when something has gone seriously wrong. "You shouldn't be out here," he said immediately. "You're still—" "Richard," quietly. "The backup ventilators are down. 3 patients. Engineering has been working for 3 hours." He went still. "You've maintained the mechanical systems on this floor for 4 years," she said. "You've repaired equipment that other people signed off as beyond saving." She looked at him with an evenness that had nothing in it of the CEO, and everything in it of the woman who had spent 7 weeks learning to tell the difference between the people who showed up and the people who didn't. "I'm not asking because of any job title. I'm asking because I know how you think. You see what needs to be done, and you do it, not for recognition, but because it's right. That is exactly what this moment needs." He looked at the supply cart, then at the corridor leading to the panel room. "Board 7, he said quietly. She blinked. "What?" "Same cascade failure pattern as the 3rd floor backup in 2022. The fault will be in board 7. It reads partially active, so the standard diagnostic categorizes it as stable and moves on." He paused. "That's where I'd start." She stepped aside without another word. He took 9 minutes. Later, Douglas tried to explain it to 3 different people and gave up each time. The fault had hidden behind a partial active reading on board 7, exactly as Richard had described, in a configuration that the automated system had passed over entirely. Richard had looked at it for less than a minute, taken a screwdriver and a voltage meter from his cart, and worked with the steady, unhurried focus of someone who has spent a lifetime repairing things because replacement was never an option. The ventilators came back online at 1:54 a.m. The room went silent. Then somebody started clapping, then everybody did. Engineers, nurses, board members, even the CFO, who had once told Richard at a building-wide meeting to stay in your lane, please, was on his feet. And he had the grace to look like a man sitting quietly with something about himself. Richard set the screwdriver on the cart. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look like a man waiting to be seen. He looked like a man whose mind was already somewhere down the corridor, in the 3 rooms, where 3 patients were breathing steadily again, alone, with no one sitting beside them. He was thinking about whether anyone had thought to check on them. And then the door at the far end of the corridor opened. Sophia walked in. She had been at the nurse's station. She had heard every minute of it. She stood at the end of the corridor and looked at him, and what happened next was something none of them had planned, or rehearsed, or seen coming, not even her. Sophia had come back to the hospital because she couldn't sleep. No epiphany, no moment of clarity. She had been lying on top of the hotel covers fully dressed, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that looked a little like the state of Florida. At some point, her body had simply stood up, put her coat on, and walked out the door. She didn't examine the impulse too closely. She had learned in 19 years that some things are better acted on before your brain has the chance to argue. She'd pieced the story together from a nurse at the station, the failed system, the engineering team. 3 hours, 9 minutes. She had walked to the corridor doorway and stood there, listening, as the ventilators beeped back online and the room broke into applause. She watched Richard set the screwdriver on the cart. She watched him not take a bow. She watched him look down the corridor, toward the rooms, toward the patients, with the expression of a man whose first thought, even now, was whether someone else needed something that had been wound very tight inside her chest. Something she had been carrying since she was 10 years old. When she'd come home from school to an apartment that smelled like fresh flowers from the housekeeper, and felt, underneath all of it, absolutely empty. It began to loosen. She walked toward him, and before she had fully decided to do what she was about to do, she did it. She went to her knees, right there on the corridor linoleum, in her coat, in front of engineers and nurses and a CFO who had the good sense to suddenly find something interesting to look at in the other direction. "I'm sorry," she said. It came out fractured, not rehearsed, not shaped for an audience, just true. "I was scared, and I was wrong about you, and I said things that weren't fair, and I am sorry." Richard looked down at her. "Hey," he said gently. "Hey, get up, please." She did, unsteadily, and he waited. The way you wait for someone doing the necessary and difficult work of collecting themselves. "I've been frightened since the accident," she said. 7 weeks of it, with nowhere to put it, and I've spent my whole life not knowing how to be scared out loud. She didn't teach me that one. She didn't mean to. She was teaching me to be strong." Sophia's voice caught. "I just ended up learning how to be alone instead." Richard looked at her for a long moment. "You were protecting her," he said. "That's what you were supposed to do." "I protected her from the wrong person." "Yes," he said simply, "but you came back." She looked at him. Then she looked past him, to her mother, standing near the window at the far end of the corridor. Simone had been watching. She hadn't moved. Sophia walked past Richard slowly. She stopped in front of her mother, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. The years between them were visible in the space. All the conferences in Chicago, all the missed school plays, all the dinners eaten alone at a counter that seated 2. "I kept the drawings," Simone said quietly. "The ones you made when you were little. The houses with the suns in the corner. I kept every one." Sophia's jaw tightened. Her eyes went bright. You never told me that. I know, Simone said. I kept a lot of things I never told you, I thought. If I could give you enough, the company, the tuition, the apartment, that would be the same as being there. That would be enough. She stopped. It wasn't. No, Sophia said. It wasn't. And then Sophia put her arms around her mother, carefully, as though the woman might break or might disappear, both of which had recently seemed possible. And Simone held on, with the grip of someone who had been wanting to do exactly this for a very long time, and wasn't sure she'd been allowed. Richard stood at the window and looked at the harbor lights and gave them the moment. Later, when the corridor had cleared and the engineers had gone home, and Preston had finally been allowed to send his emails, Simone came to stand beside Richard. Simone came to stand beside Richard at the east-facing window. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. When you sang to me, that first night, before you knew my name, before I could offer you anything, or open my eyes, or even thank you, she steadied herself. No one in my adult life has ever simply stayed. Not without wanting something back. Not once. I know, he said. I could tell, even then. I fell in love with you, she said simply. Somewhere in those weeks, in the dark, listening to your voice, I fell in love with who you were when you thought no one important was watching. Richard looked at the harbor lights moving slowly through the dark. I've been alone a while too, he said softly. Longer than my kids know. She reached over and took his hand. He looked down at it, her hand in his. And something in his face settled, the way a room settles when someone finally comes home and turns the light on. He let her. March 15th, 2026, the hospital garden. Nurse Lily had helped string lights through the bare branches of the ash trees along the path, the same battery-powered kind, $4 a strand, because Simone had been specific, and Richard had laughed and said, "Of course you were." The chairs were filled with hospital staff and board members and Richard's mother, and, in the front row, his grandmother. Finally released from room 412, in her good wool coat, grape candy in her pocket, already crying before the first note played. Oliver walked first, small suit, the expression of a 5-year-old enduring formal wear on the solemn promise of a very large piece of cake. Olivia walked beside Simone, holding her hand. Halfway down the aisle, she looked up and said, clearly, with full confidence, at a volume that reached the first 5 rows easily, "Now you're our mom. I've been practicing songs for whenever you're sad. I want you to know I am much better than Dad." The garden laughed, then cried, then laughed again. The way people do when something is so right and so true that they cannot decide which response is appropriate, and so they offer both. Richard, standing at the end of the aisle, pressed one hand flat to his chest for a moment. Still there, all of it. That night, after, kids asleep, house warm and quiet, the last of the wedding lights still glowing softly on the kitchen table where someone had set them. Simone rested her head on his shoulder. "During those 7 weeks," she said softly, "you were the only thing that made my heart feel like it still belonged to me. Not the machines, not the hospital. You. Your voice, your children's drawings, the way you said goodnight to a room you thought couldn't hear you." Richard smiled. He pulled her close and softly. In the dark of a house that was no longer too quiet. In a room where no one was alone anymore. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." A single father walked into the wrong room. He walked out with the love of his life. And somewhere between those two moments, in the singing, the sitting, the quiet daily choice to stay with someone who couldn't give him anything back, something happened that doesn't have a clean name. Something that looked, from the outside, like a mistake. It wasn't. This story teaches us something most of us already know, but forget, quietly, one busy year at a time. The people we love do not need our success, they need our presence. Not the version of us that shows up when everything is finished and the calendar finally clears, but the version that sits down in the chair, right now, even when the room is quiet and nothing we do seems to matter. Richard never fixed Simone with money or status or the right words at the right moment. He fixed her with the one thing that cannot be bought, delegated, or scheduled for later. He showed up every night without being asked, without expecting anything back. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. Don't wait until someone is lying in a hospital bed to let them hear your voice. Sing now while there is still time. This story was written by a human with AI as a companion. It came from a very simple wish, to awaken the lingering goodness in every heart and to gently remind us that no matter how bumpy life gets, there are always beautiful moments and small miracles quietly waiting for us to open our hearts and embrace them.